She fell asleep on a stranger's arm at 30,000 feet, and that one accidental moment set off a chain of events neither of them could have predicted, planned for, or walked away from unchanged. But let's back up, because before the airplane, before the stranger, before the latte explosion that would later become the stuff of legend in Sophie Reyes' circle of friends, there was Houston. And if you're going to understand this story, you first have to understand the city it was born in. Houston doesn't ask for your attention. It doesn't perform for you. It doesn't tilt its skyline just so, or dress up its bayous for the weekend. Houston simply is loud and layered and unapologetically alive, a city where you can eat world-class Vietnamese barbecue 2 blocks from a Tex-Mex brunch spot that's been slinging homemade tortillas since before you were born, where art cars parade down the streets like a fever dream nobody thought to question, and where the evening sky turns so deep and amber over the downtown glass towers that even the most hard-hearted cynic stops walking for just a second and thinks, yeah, all right, I get it. Houston is a city that gets under your skin. And for Sophie Reyes, it had been doing exactly that for 31 years. Sophie was, by every measurable standard, a woman who had her life together. She ran a mid-sized tech consulting firm, Reyes Solutions, out of a clean-lined office space in Midtown with exposed brick walls and a coffee machine that cost more than her first car. Her team trusted her. Her clients called her back. And every morning she walked into that office with the kind of quiet authority that comes not from arrogance, but from having rebuilt something, herself, her career, her sense of the future, after the ground beneath her had given way. Her father, Marcus Reyes, had died 3 years prior. And that grief, the real, layered, complicated grief of losing a parent who was also a mentor, also a rival spirit, also the reason you believed in building things from scratch. Sophie carried it the way you carry something heavy you refuse to put down. Not because you can't, but because putting it down feels like letting go of the last warm thing. Marcus had built his own firm, Reyes Digital Solutions, in the stubborn, big-dreaming Houston tradition. He had believed in his city, in his work, in the wild and persistent idea that a man with a vision and a strong enough handshake could carve out something that lasts. His firm still stood, small, fiercely independent, proudly bearing his name. And Sophie, without ever announcing it, had made it her quiet mission to keep it that way, to protect the legacy, to make sure the name Reyes meant something in this city long after Marcus wasn't here to say it himself. As for love, well, Sophie had tried that too, and it had not, to put it generously, gone well. There had been someone, not so long ago, who had made her feel like maybe the walls she'd built were worth dismantling. And then he'd left, and she'd learned the expensive lesson that walls exist for a reason, and that the most dangerous thing you can do is believe you no longer need yours. So Sophie had made a quiet, sensible, very Sophie arrangement with herself. Work came first. Houston came second. And romance could take a seat somewhere in the back, behind the quarterly reports and the client calls, and the very full, very intentional life she had constructed with her own 2 hands. Her best friend Maya naturally found this arrangement personally offensive. Maya Okonkwo had known Sophie since college, which meant she had a lifetime's worth of evidence that Sophie Reyes was, beneath all that capability and humor and self-sufficiency, a woman who felt things enormously, who laughed like she meant it and loved like she meant it, and had simply at some point decided that meaning was too costly. Maya had been conducting a long and largely one-sided campaign to change Sophie's mind about this. It involved blind date setups that Sophie canceled, dating apps that Sophie downloaded and deleted, and a running commentary on every remotely attractive man within a 3-block radius of wherever they happened to be standing. Sophie's response to all of this was, consistently, a raised eyebrow and a remark sharp enough to end conversation, but never sharp enough to actually hurt. Because Sophie Reyes was funny the way only truly warm people are funny. Her humor was a door, not a wall. She just kept forgetting to open it. The Chicago conference had been on her calendar for 6 weeks. A tech industry summit. Panels, keynotes, networking dinners with people who said synergy without irony. Not Sophie's favorite environment, but a necessary one. The market was shifting. Larger conglomerates were circling Houston's mid-tier tech space like patient, well-funded bird to prey, and Sophie needed to scout partnerships, shore up relationships, and come home with a clearer sense of which way the wind was blowing. She packed efficiently, kissed Maya on the cheek over a rushed coffee, and told her she'd be back in 3 days. Maya told her to talk to at least one human being who wasn't a client. Sophie told her that was a completely unreasonable request. They both knew she was right and wrong at the same time. Gate C-14, Houston George Bush Intercontinental Airport. Sophie arrived with 12 minutes to spare. Enough time, she calculated, for a cinnamon-dusted café d'Olya from the terminal coffee kiosk and a moment of stillness before the conference noise began. She got the coffee. She did not get the stillness. The gate was crowded. The overhead bins were going to be a war zone, and the man at the counter had managed to print her boarding pass with the wrong seat number, which had to be corrected, which took 9 of her 12 minutes. She boarded brisk, coffee in hand, carry-on rolling behind her, and made her way down the aisle with the focused energy of a woman who had a window seat, a playlist ready, and absolutely no interest in conversation. And then she found her row, and in the seat directly beside hers, the aisle seat, broad-shouldered and unavoidable, sat a man who looked like he had been personally assembled to take up space in the most quietly commanding way imaginable. Dark hair, strong jaw, dressed in a suit that fit with the kind of precision that doesn't happen by accident, and in his hands, held with the same seriousness a scholar might bring to an ancient text, a management book with a title so aggressively corporate that Sophie, reading it upside down as she hoisted her carry-on, actually pressed her lips together to keep from laughing out loud. He looked up. His eyes were steady, dark, and gave absolutely nothing away. Sophie smiled, the polite, efficient, I acknowledge your existence smile of a seasoned traveler, and slid into her seat. She put her coffee in the cup holder. She put her headphones on. She looked out the window. She lasted approximately 4 minutes. Is it good? She asked. He looked up again. A beat. Is what good? The book. You're holding it like it contains the secrets of the universe. Another beat. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite amusement, but adjacent to it. The way a person looks when they've been caught doing something mildly embarrassing, and they're deciding whether to acknowledge it or double down. He glanced at the cover. Back at her. It's adequate, he said, which was such a specific, guarded, unexpectedly funny response that Sophie laughed. A real one, not the polished social variety. Before she could think better of it. His name, she would learn over the next 40 minutes of turbulence-assisted conversation, was Ethan. He offered the first name easily enough, but the last with a slight pause she didn't register at the time. He was quiet in the way that some people are quiet not because they have nothing to say, but because they've learned to be careful about what they release into the world. He answered her questions with a dry economy that she found, to her own mild surprise, genuinely entertaining. He was clearly not used to being teased. He was handling it with a kind of careful, slightly baffled dignity that only made the teasing more irresistible. She asked what he did. He said he ran a company. She asked which one. He said tech. She gave him a look that said that is not an answer, and he almost smiled, the ghost of it, just at the corner of his mouth, before he redirected with a question about her, which she answered with a full, unedited version because Sophie had never learned the art of being vague and wasn't about to start at cruising altitude. And somewhere over Arkansas, she would pinpoint it later, with the precision of someone reconstructing a crime scene. The conversation slowed. The hum of the engine settled into something almost rhythmic, and Sophie Reyes, against every intention, fell asleep. She listed sideways, incrementally, the way sleep pulls you when you fight it and lose. And her head came to rest, gently without drama, as though it found exactly where it meant to go, against Ethan's arm. He went very still. He did not move, did not clear his throat, did not do the socially obvious thing, and shift away, or nudge her upright. He sat there, this composed and private man with his corporate book and his careful words, and he let her sleep. And if anyone had been watching from the row behind, if, say, the flight attendant passing with a beverage cart had glanced over at exactly the right moment, they might have caught the expression that crossed his face in that unguarded instant. Something quiet and wondering and a little undone. But nobody was watching. And so the moment belonged only to the two of them, though Sophie didn't know it yet. When she woke, jolted by a pocket of turbulence somewhere over Tennessee, The sequence of realizations happened very fast. Where she was, where her head was, whose arm that was. Sophie came fully upright with the velocity of a woman who has been startled out of sleep in public and is attempting, in real time, to restore her dignity while simultaneously processing a significant amount of mortification. She started. I don't usually, she stopped. Looked at him. His expression was neutral, except for the absolute war happening in his eyes between amusement and the effort not to show it. Don't, she said, pointing at him. Whatever face you're making, stop it. I'm not making a face, he said. You're making a face on the inside, and I can tell. And that was a moment. Not the landing, not the number exchange, not the easy laughter that carried them off the jetway and into the terminal. That was the exact moment something shifted. Because he laughed. A real one. The real thing. Unguarded and warm. Brief as a struck match. And gone almost before it registered. But Sophie caught it. Filed it somewhere she didn't name. They deplaned, still talking. Swap numbers at the terminal split with the casual momentum of two people pretending it doesn't mean what it means. Sophie walked toward baggage claim, telling herself it was nothing. A funny story, a good nap, a stranger with decent dry humor, and inexplicably excellent posture. She told herself she'd be back in 3 days. She told herself Houston was waiting. She told herself she had a conference to focus on. She told herself a lot of things. But here's the question that should sit with you. The one Sophie didn't think to ask herself until it was already too late. What does it mean when a man who could have looked away chooses, without hesitation, to hold you steady instead? And more unsettling still, what does it mean when the woman who built her whole life around not needing to be held finds herself, just for a moment, grateful that he did? Whatever it means, Sophie Reyes is about to find out. And nothing in Houston or anywhere else will ever quite be the same. Here's something nobody tells you about falling for someone you shouldn't. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with a warning label or a flashing signal, or even a single dramatic moment you can point to later and say, that's where it started. No, it creeps in quietly, wrapped in something that looks harmless. A laugh, a shared taco, a man falling off a mechanical bull with a kind of helpless, full-body lack of grace that makes you realize, with mild alarm, that you find him absolutely endearing. That's how it starts. Not with fireworks, with laughter. And by the time you notice what's actually happening, you're already in it. Deeper than you planned, further than you meant to go, and standing in a city that seems impossibly to be conspiring against your better judgment. Sophie Reyes came back from Chicago on a Tuesday. She had her notes from the conference, her client follow-ups queued in her inbox, and a very clear plan for the next 3 months that had absolutely no room in it for Ethan, whose last name she still hadn't confirmed, whose company she had only a vague outline of, and whose number was sitting in her phone under the contact name she typed at the terminal. Airplane guy. Adequate book. She did not text him. That was the plan. The plan lasted 48 hours. He texted first. No preamble, no opener, no hey, it was great meeting you warm-up. Just a single line. I'm in Houston for the next few weeks. Still owe you a better conversation than the one I gave you at 30,000 feet. Sophie read it 3 times. She showed it to Maya, who read it once, set her coffee down with ceremony, and said, Sophie, that man practiced that text. Sophie told her she was being dramatic, but she typed back, carefully, casually, in the way that takes longer than it looks. And by Thursday evening, she was leading a quietly brooding Texio she barely knew through the beating, beautiful, wonderfully chaotic heart of her city. And Houston, because Houston has always had opinions, decided to be extraordinary. She took him everywhere. Not the polished, tourist-facing version of the city. Not the curated downtown walk with the glass towers and the manicured riverfront. Sophie took Ethan to the real thing. The lair and alive and sometimes inexplicable Houston that she had grown up in and fought for and loved without condition. They started at the art car parade. Because if you want to know whether a person has any soul at all, you watch their face when a 1987 Buick covered in 12,000 bottle caps and a 12-foot welded skeleton rolls past at a dignified 15 miles per hour. Ethan's face did something extraordinary. It went completely blank for exactly 3 seconds, and then something broke open in it quiet and real, and he said, without irony, "I genuinely don't know what to say about that." And Sophie laughed and said, "That's the right answer." And they kept walking. From there, Miller Outdoor Theater under a wide, generous spring sky. Free concerts and the smell of cut grass and easy, unstructured pleasure sitting on a hillside with no agenda. They shared ice cream from a cart and argued amiably about whether Tex-Mex or Vietnamese Tex fusion represented Houston's highest culinary achievement. A debate that was conclusively settled at Koi Barbecue, where Ethan, this composed, buttoned-up management book-reading man, took one bite of Viet Tex brisket and went so quiet and reverent that Sophie had to look away to keep from smiling too wide. But it was a mechanical bull at Rodeo Houston that produced a moment Sophie would replay for weeks. Ethan, in a fit of either misguided confidence or genuine willingness to embarrass himself for the sake of the afternoon, agreed to get on. He lasted 6 seconds. The dismount was, there is no other word for it, spectacular. Full rotation. Both feet off simultaneously. The landing was technically successful in that he remained alive. Sophie had her phone out by second 3 and documented the entire thing with the focus of a National Geographic photographer capturing something rare in the wild. He stood up, adjusted his jacket, and looked at her with an expression of such resigned dignity that she nearly dropped the phone laughing. "That happened," he said. "It absolutely happened," she confirmed, already sending it to Maya. Here is what Sophie would not admit to herself in those early days. Not directly. Not yet. Ethan was not what she constructed him to be in her head. She'd built him, in the 48 hours after flight, into a type, wealthy, closed off, the kind of man for whom charm is a business tool and warmth is a quarterly strategy. She'd done it deliberately, because types are manageable. Types don't surprise you. But Ethan, in person and in Houston, kept quietly refusing to be the type she'd assigned him. He asked the street vendor at the parade about the materials he used on his car, not politely, genuinely curious, leaning in to hear the answer. He gave up his bench at the theater when an older woman couldn't find a seat without making anything of it, without waiting to be noticed for it. He was careful with his words, yes, but not cold. He was more like a man who had learned, somewhere along the way, that speaking carelessly cost something and had decided the cost wasn't worth it, and that Sophie Reyes, that should have been the first signal, not the laughter, not the mechanical bull, the carefulness. Because a man that careful with his words is a man with something worth protecting. And the question she didn't ask, the question nobody asks when they're having too good a time to stop, is, what exactly is he protecting? The Tex-Mex brunch happened on a Saturday, and became immediately the kind of story that gets told at every gathering for the next 10 years. Sophie's caramel latte, a faulty milk frother, a table position at exactly the wrong angle, and Ethan's sand-colored linen suit never stood a chance. The explosion was minor by any objective measure. The result was not. He sat there for a full 2 seconds, completely still, wearing an expression of such profound and dignified disbelief that every person at the surrounding tables noticed. Sophie's apology lasted approximately 4 words before it collapsed entirely into laughter. He looked at her. He looked at his jacket. He looked back at her, still laughing, helpless and bright-eyed and completely unguarded, and something in his own expression shifted, softened, in a way that had nothing to do with the suit and everything to do with her. He smiled, slowly, from the corner of his mouth, until it became the real thing. "I have 11 of these," he said finally. "Good," Sophie managed, still catching her breath. They were getting too much mileage anyway. That night, walking along Buffalo Bayou Park in the long amber light of a Houston evening, something changed in the texture of their conversation. The ease was still there. Sophie's instinct for humor, Ethan's dry, careful wit. But under it, something quieter was moving. She told him about her father. Not the whole story, not the deep architecture of grief and legacy and unfinished business. But enough. She told him Marcus had loved the city the way some people love people, fiercely and with specificity. And that every time she walked this stretch of the bayou, she felt him close by. Ethan listened the way people rarely listen, without preparing his response while she talked, without rushing to fill the space she left. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Some people leave marks on the city. You can feel where they walked. It was not a grand statement, but it was so precisely the right thing that Sophie felt it land somewhere in her chest and stay there, warm and unexpected, like a candle lit in a room you've forgotten about. She asked about his family. A pause came over him, brief, almost imperceptible, the kind that only means something when you're already paying attention. My father, he said, built his world around winning. I spent a long time trying to figure out if there was another way to build. That was all he gave her. And Sophie, whose instinct was always to follow a thread, let it go. She filed it, the way you file something you know you'll return to. What she did not file, what she should have, what changes everything in retrospect, was a phone call, the fourth one that week from the same contact. The way his jaw set when he saw the screen, the way his voice, when he finally answered it briefly, took on a register she hadn't heard him use before. Control clipped, the voice of a man conducting business he would rather not be conducting. He returned to her side within 2 minutes. Changed the subject. She let him. She told herself it was nothing. A work thing. Every CEO had work things. She had work things. That was normal. She almost convinced herself she believed it. Almost. The rooftop dinner was Ethan's idea, and it surprised her. Not the invitation. She'd sensed, by that point, that he was navigating toward something in the slow, methodical way of a man who takes nothing lightly. What surprised her was the care of it. A quiet rooftop space above a midtown restaurant. Not flashy, not a grand gesture, but thoughtful. Her kind of thoughtful. The kind that says I was paying attention to what you said, not just what you showed me. He'd arranged cafe to Alia because she'd mentioned on day 2, and she hadn't expected him to remember. She hadn't expected a lot of things about Ethan Cole that had already turned out to be true. They sat across from each other in the early evening light, Houston glittering below, and Ethan looked at her with the expression of a man who has made a decision and is standing on the edge of it. He started to speak. Sophie, there's something I should tell you. The flight wasn't, and that was as far as he got, because his phone lit up on the table between them, urgent, insistent, his executive assistant's name on the screen, and the moment, which had been so precisely balanced, tipped and fell. He took the call. He stepped away. He came back 3 minutes later with the shuttered look of a man who has retreated back behind glass, and Sophie watched it happen and said nothing and smiled, and the rest of the evening was good, but not what it had been 4 minutes before. Not quite. Here's the thing about open doors. They don't stay open on their own. And Sophie, riding home that night in the quiet of her car with the Houston skyline in the rearview mirror, felt the edge of something she couldn't name. A current beneath the surface of everything warm and funny and wonderful about the past 2 weeks. Something unfinished. A sentence without its end. She just didn't know yet that the ending was already written, and that somewhere in a boardroom filing she hadn't seen, in an acquisition document she hadn't been shown, in the archived pages of business rivalry that had never truly been buried, the ground beneath Sophie Reyes was preparing, quietly, to give way again. So ask yourself this, because Sophie should have. When someone who is careful with every word starts to say something important and then stops, is it the interruption that matters, or is it the fact that they were relieved to be interrupted? The answer is coming, and it will cost them both more than either of them is prepared to pay. So here's the question that sat at the center of everything, the one Sophie Reyes carried with her into the worst week of her life, and couldn't put down no matter how hard she tried. Can you trust someone who kept a secret? If the secret they kept was you, hold that thought, because the answer, the real one, not the easy one, is going to ask something of you too. And Sophie had to earn it the hard way. The way most true things are earned, by walking straight to the fire of what she feared most before she could reach what she actually wanted. The gala was supposed to be a good night. By every external measure, it was the kind of Houston evening that reminds you the city knows how to dress up when it wants to, all glass and warm light. And the skyline doing exactly what a skyline should do, which is make you feel like you're standing inside something worth protecting. Sophie wore a deep burgundy dress that Maya had selected with the focused energy of a woman who had been planning this moment in her head for weeks. Ethan, when he saw her across the room, did something with his expression that he clearly hadn't prepared for and couldn't fully conceal, a stillness, quick and unguarded, before the composure returned. Sophie caught it. She catalogued it. She smiled about it privately for exactly 4 minutes, which was how long it took before a phone rang with client emergency that required her full attention and a quiet corner of the hallway. She was gone 20 minutes. When she came back, his chair was empty. The night had pulled him, board members, obligations, the relentless gravity of running something large and complicated. And he'd left a message through Mr. Caldwell that amounted to an apology she didn't receive until she was already in the car. Maya, beside her in the back seat, reached over and held her hand without saying anything, which was how Sophie knew she looked as deflated as she felt. She told herself it was fine. A missed evening. Not a sign. Not a pattern. Just a busy man and bad timing. She almost made it to morning believing that. The call came at 9:47 on a Tuesday from her company accountant. In the flat, careful tone of someone delivering news they'd been rehearsing. Cole Ventures, a name she now knew like a heartbeat, had moved to formally acquire Reyes Digital Solutions, her father's firm. The small, stubborn, proudly independent company that still bore Marcus Reyes' name on its door and philosophy in every corner of its operation. The acquisition, if completed, would absorb entirely, dissolve the brand, retire the name, erase the last visible, standing proof that Marcus Reyes had built something in the city that outlasted him. Sophie sat very still at her desk for a long time after that call ended. And then she did what she always did when the world required understanding. She researched. She pulled every public filing, every archived business record, every old Houston Business Journal article she could find. And that was how she found it. Buried in a 2003 feature on Houston's emerging tech sector, a profile of two rival firms and the men who built them, Gerald Cole and Marcus Reyes. Two fathers. Two companies. A contract dispute that had cost both of them dearly, that had left bad blood and worse silence, and that had apparently been so definitively unresolved that its gravity had stretched all the way into the next generation without anyone announcing it. She stared at a photo of a younger Gerald Cole. She thought about the pause Ethan had taken when she asked about his family. My father built his world around winning. She thought about the phone calls Ethan never fully explained. She thought about the rooftop dinner and the sentence he'd started and never finished. The flight wasn't, and she felt the floor beneath her, which she had been so careful to rebuild and reinforce, begin to tilt. She called him. He answered on the second ring. She asked him directly. No preamble, no softening, just a straight line from question to truth, because Sophie Reyes had never known how to do it any other way. Did you know who I was before that flight? The pause that followed was 3 seconds long. She counted them. And in those 3 seconds, before he said a single word, she had her answer. Yes, he said finally. But Sophie, let me... She hung up. What followed was a kind of silence that has weight to it. Sophie moved through the next several days with the mechanical precision of someone who has locked something down so completely that even they can't find it. She went to work. She answered emails. She sat across from Maya at their usual brunch spot and let Maya talk without hearing most of it, nodding in approximately the right places. She was fine. She was absolutely, completely, structurally fine, and she was falling apart in a way that left no visible seam for anyone to find. It was a Sunday afternoon when she finally went to her father's office. Not Reyes Solutions, her company, her space. The other one, the original, Reyes Digital, small and a little worn, tucked into a building in East Downtown that Marcus had chosen because he liked the light through the east-facing windows in the morning. She let herself in with the key she'd never taken off her ring, and she sat in her father's old chair, and she let the quiet of the place settle around her. His city was visible through the window, Houston in full Sunday ease, unhurried and golden, and entirely indifferent to her heartbreak in the most comforting possible way. She sat there and thought about Marcus, not the rival in the archives, not the founding figure, the legacy, the name she'd pledged herself to protect, just her father, the man who made terrible Tex-Mex and believed every time that this batch was going to be the one, who called Houston the greatest city on earth with a regularity that would have been embarrassing if he hadn't so clearly, so completely meant it, who told her, more than once, in the particular way of fathers who know their daughters are braver than they let themselves believe, the bravest thing a person can do, soft, is want something and reach for it anyway. She sat with that for a long time. And she thought about Ethan at the bayou, saying some people leave marks on the city. You can feel where they walked. She thought about 6 seconds on a mechanical bull and a ruined linen suit and a rooftop with Café de Olla, because she'd mentioned it on day 2. She thought about a man on a plane choosing, without hesitation, to hold her steady while she slept. And she thought about what it means to be a person who is careful with every word. Not because you're cold, but because you understand that words, once released, change things. Whether the man who approached her knowing her name is the same man who looked at her at the Miller Theater and couldn't quite keep his face composed. Whether history is something you inherit or something you choose. She didn't have the answer yet, but she had the question. And for Sophie Reyes, a good question was always the beginning of something. He found her at the Miller Theater on a Sunday evening, her Sunday ritual, the one she'd mentioned in passing on day 1 of the Houston tour. He'd remembered that, too. He came alone, no Caldwell, no phone visible, no prepared speech apparent. He simply walked down the hillside to where she was sitting and sat down beside her without asking, the way you do when you're past the part where asking feels like the right formality. She looked at him. He looked at the stage. The concert was something soft and instrumental, generous to the moment. When he spoke, he didn't defend himself. That was the first thing she noticed. No architecture of justification. No careful repositioning of the facts to cast himself in better light. He said, I found your name in the acquisition files, and I was curious about you. I booked the flight. And then I sat next to you, and everything I thought I was doing stopped making sense. He said, I should have told you before it mattered this much. That's on me, and I know it. He said, I'm not here to ask you to forgive the timing. I'm here because I pulled the acquisition. He reached into his jacket. A single document, formal and finalized. Cole Ventures' official withdrawal from the Reyes Digital Solutions acquisition. He set it on the bench between them and left his hand near it. Not pushing it toward her, just making it available. I didn't want to buy it. He said quietly, I wanted you to know it's not in play. Whatever you decide tonight, that part's already done. Sophie looked at the document. She looked at Houston spread out beyond the theater, lit and alive and entirely itself. She thought about her father and the city and the brave thing. She looked at Ethan, this careful, private, imperfectly honest man who had fallen off a mechanical bull for her and let her sleep on his arm and remembered Café de Olla and was sitting beside her now without armor, without leverage, without anything except a plain and somewhat vulnerable truth. She said, I want to show you something. And she stood up and he followed. The rooftop above her father's building was Sophie's place. Hers alone. The one she'd never shown anyone. The one she went when the city felt like too much or not enough. Houston from that height in the evening was something close to sacred. The skyline catching the last light. The streets below moving in their easy Friday rhythm. The whole improbable, layered, endlessly alive city stretching out like a promise someone had actually kept. She stood beside Ethan at the railing and told him about Marcus, the real version, the man behind the legacy, the bad cooking, the big belief, the absolute and unshakable conviction that building something honest in a city you love is its own kind of argument for being alive. And then she turned to face him, and she said, my father would have told me to fight you, to protect the name, hold the line, keep the history where I could see it. A pause. But my father also told me that the bravest thing a person can do is want something and reach for it anyway. She looked at him steadily, the way Sophie Reyes looked at everything she had decided to take seriously. So I'm reaching. What happened next was, by their own later admission, a little awkward. Ethan moved at the same time she did. Someone misjudged the angle. There may have been a brief moment where their foreheads made contact before their lips did, which Sophie would describe as on brand for them, and Ethan would describe as not how he planned it. And she would say he couldn't have planned it because planning was a whole problem. And he would almost argue and then laugh instead, that real laugh, brief and warm and entirely unguarded, the one she'd first caught at 30,000 feet over Tennessee and filed somewhere she hadn't named. She kissed him. He held on. Houston glittered beneath them, indifferent and magnificent and completely unbothered by the fact that two people on a rooftop had just decided, against considerable odds in family history and the general difficulty of trusting someone after you've been hurt, to choose each other anyway. The weeks that followed were not without their complications. Because real life, even in a story this warm, insists on being real. There were conversations about the Cole and Reyes history that required honesty and patience from both sides. There were moments where old wounds announced themselves unexpectedly, the way old wounds do. There were dinners where Ethan's phone buzzed and Sophie raised an eyebrow, and he turned it face down without being asked, a small thing that meant everything. There was Maya, insufferably and completely correctly smug, who accepted her victory with the grace of someone who had earned the right to say, I told you so, and said it approximately 40 times over the course of a single brunch. There was Mr. Caldwell, spotted at a corner table at that same brunch, reading a dog-eared rom-com novel. He slid under the table when he noticed Sophie looking, and who Sophie greeted with a nod that said your secret is safe and meant every word of it. And there was a Tuesday morning, unremarkable, unhurried, when Sophie walked into her Midtown office and found a cinnamon-scented café all on her desk and no note, because none was needed. She stood there for a moment, smiled, picked it up, got to work. Houston kept being Houston, loud and layered and unapologetically alive. The city that doesn't ask for your attention but holds it anyway, that hides its best things in plain sight and rewards the people willing to look past the first impression, past the polished surface, past the archived history of old grudges and inherited rivalries, down to the warm and beating thing underneath. Some cities are a backdrop. Houston is a character. And like every great character, it knows that the best stories aren't about people who never get hurt. They're about people who get hurt and choose and reach and stay. Sophie Reyes reached. That's the whole story. That's the only story. And it started, the way the best ones always do, with something that looked like an accident, a long flight, an adjacent seat, a woman falling asleep on a stranger's arm, and a man who chose, without hesitation, to hold her steady. Now here's what we want to know from you, because this story belongs to everyone who watches it, and we believe you have something worth saying. Drop it in the comments right now. Have you ever had a meet-cute moment, a chance encounter, an unlikely beginning, a story that started with something small and became something real? Tell us. The funniest one, the most unexpected one, the one you still think about. And if you've never had yours yet, tell us what you imagine it looks like. We read every single one. And while you're down there, if Sophie and Ethan's story move you even a little, hit that like button, because it helps more people find stories worth their time. Subscribe if you haven't, because we tell these stories every week, and the next one is already in the works. And trust us when we say, it starts somewhere you will absolutely not expect. We'll see you there.